if you're new to Photoshop, don't be overwhelmed. It's a very expansive program and can take years to truly master. Go ahead and get in there and start making your own artwork, editing your own photos, and you'll get comfortable with the interface in no time. Some of the key concepts that we covered today are how to create a file, working in the correct file format, working to scale. It is an amazing tool, but first you got to know what you want to do with it. And when you first open up Photoshop, it should look something like this. And we're going to learn the first important step, which is how to create a new file. So I'm going to go up here to File, New. You might also get a dialog that looks a little different, but once I click on File, New, or Control N, it's going to open up this dialog. And we're going to want to work to the scale that our final composition is going to come out in. In this case, it's going to be for the screen for 1080p display. So I'm going to go ahead and just double check that that preset is correct. There's also a bunch of different presets up here based on what medium you are working in, be that photo, print, illustration, web, mobile, or name your project right now. Here's the dimension of the project, the resolution. 72 pixels per inch is the standard for screen resolution. And what color mode you're working in. RGB is the standard for screen resolution. Ask if you want Photoshop to manage the color profile for you. And that means it's just going to interpolate whatever color information the images that you're working with have into a specific consistent color profile. So in this case, we're going to choose working RGB. Okay. So here we have our new document created. Let's press create, and there it is. Okay, great. So that's step one. We familiarize ourselves with how to create a new document. Step two would be how to work with the layers. So Photoshop creates one layer with a new document, and that is your background layer. Okay. To create a new layer, you can either click on this little box with the plus sign in it, create new layer, or you can go layer on the top menu, new layer, or the shortcut is Shift Control N. Okay. And each layer that you create stacks upon the previous layer so that they are in fact layered. Da-ding. This approximates a graphic design workflow from previous years before software. In addition to understanding how the layers themselves work, or one object on a new layer is stacked upon a previous layer, right? I'm going to demonstrate that by just stacking different colored boxes on top of one another. Okay. Now if I hit F7 to pull up my layers palette, you'll see each of these rectangles acts as its own layer, one on top of the next, and I can now come in and rearrange them as I like. Okay. Shapes in Photoshop now are drawn as what are called smart vector objects, so they are pretty easily editable. But if you are going to be doing a lot of manipulation of shapes or text, it is a good idea to use Adobe Illustrator or some other vector design program instead of Illustrator. Okay. In addition to understanding how the layers interact with one another and stack upon one another, it is important to understand each of these buttons on the bottom of the layers palette, and that is the FX, the blending options, the masking options, the ability to add new fill or adjustment layers, to group layers with this folder icon, to create a new layer with the plus, and to delete a layer. Create a new layer and delete a layer and folder are fairly self-explanatory. The one that you really need to dig into is masking and adding adjustment layers. So adjustment layers will affect every layer below them with the adjustment that you make on that layer, and that can be everything from the color balance to the saturation or color fill or lighting effects. A million different things can be done just using adjustment layers. So countless options can be done, and the great thing about using adjustment layers is they're non-destructive edits to the composition. Okay, so for example, I'm going to open up a photograph, right? This is Photoshop. So here's a nice photograph I took in the middle of the United States, driving through New Mexico, I think. And when you open up any document in Photoshop, it's gonna look like this with just a background layer. So the first thing I want to always do is duplicate that layer. Okay. And we're gonna call that background copy. That's fine. I'm actually gonna hide the background layer by clicking on the eyeball now. Okay. And what kind of adjustments might I want to make to this image just right off the bat looking at it? It's a little bit underexposed, meaning that the colors aren't very vibrant and the lighting is a little bit gray, right? And the first glaring issue that I see is that it's off, it's tilted. It looks like it's tilted. So we're going to want to crop this photo and rotate it, or just rotate it, really. So I could do that, but then I'm going to have these areas up here that are going to look odd, right, with a transparent background. I have a straight horizon line now, but it doesn't really work. So we do actually want to pull up the crop tool, which is over here, or you can access by pressing C, and you'll see the border change here to this. Right. First thing we want to do is rotate it. With the crop tool selected, I'm going to rotate, and those lines appear, and I can now make sure that my horizon line is parallel. Pretty good right there. I'm going to hit enter to commit the change. Still looks a little bit off, so just crop tool again, click, rotate, and just one little adjustment, right? And already the photo looks better just by that simple change, right? But what we wanted to talk about here was adjustment layers. So the next thing I'm going to do, instead of coming in here and like painting on layers on top of layers on top of layers, and making copies of this and trying out different transparencies, I'm just going to come in and click on this half black, half white circle at the bottom of the layers palette. Add first a curves adjustment. Okay, and the curves adjustment is going to allow me to, by clicking here and dragging down on the bottom, and then clicking, dragging on the top, it's going to allow me to just darken the shadows a little bit and intensify the highlights. But I actually, in this case, you see this histogram or graph in the background of our curves palette shows you there's a ton of information down here already in the dark area. So we need to up the vibrance a little bit here. Right, you don't want to overdo these type of things, but wow, that's making a huge difference. And this is one I hardly have ever used, but it seemed like, I was trying my normal tricks and they just weren't working for this one. So tried out different things. Turn off the vibrance on this layer. This is the original photo. This is with the vibrance turned on. Let's add another adjustment layer on top of that. First 5 things to learn about Photoshop. Number 1, how to create a new file. Number 2, how to navigate the layers palette and how the layers work with each other and interact with one another. Number 3, the buttons at the bottom of the layers palette, especially the adjustment layers, and just go in and add one on top of another one on top of another one and see how they're going to interact. Try them out one at a time with a photograph or with another composition that you have. Number 4, the fourth thing that we should learn when we're first learning Photoshop is shortcuts. Now, there's so many different tools that you're going to use depending on what you're doing with Photoshop. It might be different, right? So figure out what tools you're going to use the most by just using Photoshop, getting in there and doing work and working on things that you want to work on and that you need to work on. And then you'll find out what tools you're going to need to learn the shortcuts for. And I would say print up a list and paste it onto the wall right next to the computer that you're using Photoshop with, or whatever software you're trying to learn the shortcuts for. And then you'll have that list to quickly reference, so you don't have to go looking up shortcuts all the time on the internet and taking those couple minutes away from your actual work. The most used shortcuts for me personally in Photoshop for photo editing would be crop, rotate, the layers palette. So crop is C, rotate is R, and the layers palette is F7. All right. So those will be the first 3 I would learn. Eyedropper is another good one. I for eyedropper. And with the eyedropper in Photoshop, you can basically select the exact color of wherever you click, right? And that will populate into the foreground color area down here, which brings up another great shortcut, and that's X to switch between the foreground and background color. So if we're on a new layer here above everything else, and B for brush would be another great shortcut. And right now, because the foreground color is black, anything that we paint is going to come out black. If we hit X, the foreground color will switch to that blue, and anything we'll paint will come out that blue. If we hit Control Z, probably the most important shortcut, but one that everyone pretty much already knows, you can step back and undo what you just did. So those are some of the most important shortcuts to know, in my opinion. If you have some other ones, definitely leave a comment below. And always excited to learn a way to improve my workflow, and I hope you feel the same. So that's the fourth thing that we want to learn when we're learning shortcuts or learning Photoshop are the shortcuts that we need to make our work go faster. Because the faster that you're working, the smoother, the more you can get into that flow state where you're just kind of accomplishing what you're trying to do instead of thinking about it. The fifth thing that you want to focus on learning when you're learning Photoshop are the selection tools. And that starts right here with the marquee tool. The shortcut for accessing the marquee tool is M. And the marquee tool allows you to click and drag and select a specific area. You can then do things like layer, new, layer via cut or copy. So let's do layer via copy on our background layer. Make sure you got the right layer selected. Layer, new, layer via copy. And then the move tool, shortcut V to access. Right? You now have a copy of just that area of your image. Okay? So that's the marquee selection tool, M, right? I'm going to hide that layer. We don't really need that. I'm actually just going to delete it. Okay? When you click and hold down on any one of the tools in your palette over here, different options will come up. So beneath the marquee selection tool, you have the elliptical selection tool and then single row marquee tools, right? Which are useful in their own regard. Below that, you have the different lasso tools, the regular lasso tool, which just allows you to draw and select a shape, right? The polygonal lasso tool and the magnetic lasso tool, which each have their own specific applications. Play around with all these different selectors, but you're going to come to the newest of the selectors, the quick selection tool and the object selection tool. And once you start to use those, you'll find that the other selectors don't get used as often as they may have used to get used, right? So with any selection tool, it's important to understand how to add to the selection, take away from the selection, and make a new selection. And those options can typically be found up here in your different options at the top of your workspace, right? If you can't find them there, go to Window, Workspace, Reset Workspace. And once you do find a workspace that you're comfortable working in and you've customized it, save it as a custom workspace so that you can always go back to it, okay? Learn those shortcuts. It'll speed up your workflow, help you get into doing your best work as quickly as possible. All right, so thanks for watching. That was the first 5 things to learn in Photoshop. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe, and don't forget to leave a comment below and let us know what we should talk about next. I am happy to answer any questions that I possibly can in regards to the subject matter, so go ahead and leave those down in the comments as well. And I really appreciate you watching today, and I hope you have a great holiday. And go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button.